evening and welcome to the first webinar from the Rural Planning Company of 2023. We've got a series of webinars set up and this is our first in 2023. My name's Nicola Palmer and I'm the Marketing Manager at the Rural Planning Company. Whilst probably not the most exciting of topics, the subject of slurry stores is prevalent in the minds of many farmers at the moment, following the government launch of the Slurry Store grant. We're joined this evening by experts who will be able to help you negotiate your way through this grant, the planning process and your financial planning options. So we'll first hear from Emma Turnock. As many of us did in this industry that we're in, Emma studied at Harper Adams. She cut her teeth at ADAS and is now part of the sustainability team at Kite Consulting, where she is an agricultural consultant based across the Southwest and West Midlands. Hannah Moule will then cover the topic of planning and whether your proposal can be dealt with by prior notification or whether full planning will be required. Hannah is the founder and director of the Rural Planning Company. A rural chartered surveyor and planning consultant, Hannah not only has a wealth of knowledge, but also what can only be described as a huge passion for agriculture and the rural business. She's a farmer herself and strives to help farmers achieve their goals through effective use of the planning process. And lastly, we'll hear from Mel Shipley from the Oxbury Bank, and she'll talk you through the options for financing your project. Oxbury Bank are going from strength to strength. Their ethos is to champion British agriculture and they only lend to farmers and the rural economy, with enabling them to understand the specialised lending that you need to run your farm. Mel is a senior agricultural relationship manager at Oxbury Bank with previous agribusiness experience with HSB and BNZ. Her background in farming in New Zealand with her family brings additional knowledge to her role. So welcome. We'll take some questions. We'll be taking questions from the audience during the presentation. If you post them on the chat, then we will put those to the panel at the end. So without further delay, I will now hand you over to Emma, who can kick off the presentations.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Nicola, and good evening, everyone. So yeah, as Nicola said, I'm Emma Turnock and I'm a consultant at Kite. So for those of you who don't know Kite, we work sort of across the UK, predominantly within the dairy industry, with businesses sort of across the food supply chain. And one of the sort of key challenges that we see at the moment, particularly on a farm level, is complying with the environmental regulations. And in order to future-proof our farming businesses, we really need to ensure that we're meeting these regulations, the current and future regulations. And therefore, I'm going to be talking a bit tonight about those regulations and then also a bit about the Slurry infrastructure grant. So first on to the current regulations that we have. Hopefully you're sort of quite familiar with some or all of these regulations. First we have SAFO. So these regs have been around for a long time now and are really applicable to all farms across the country. And in terms of the slurry element of them, it's applicable for all stores built after 1991. And all those stores should be up to SAFO regulations, and therefore you should all have a minimum of 4 months slurry storage. Any stores built prior to 1991 are SAFO exempt, as long as they do not pose an environmental risk. However, to not pose an environmental risk, I think the sort of EA would argue that you should have that 4 month storage so you can sort of spread your slurries at times where it won't pose that environmental risk. So really all farms should try and ensure that they've got that 4 month slurry storage to comply with SAFO regulations. And then the next one on the list is MBZs. So these aren't applicable to everyone. I think it's about 55% of land in England is in an MBZ. And then over in Wales, the agricultural pollution regulations are coming into force, which are very similar to NBZs. So for all farms in Wales, and then all farms within the NBZ areas in England should have 5 months slurry storage through that. And then last on the list here is the farming rules for water. And although these don't have any direct rules and limits on the slurry storage requirement, they do have indirect rules within them, which require you to have enough slurry storage to comply. So within these rules, they stipulate that you should not spread slurry or organic manures if there's no agronomic need, or if the soils are not suitable. And so therefore the EA through these sort of has the right, if you like, to enforce them and to say that actually you should have 5 or 6 months slurry storage in case there are 5 or 6 months where spreading cannot take place. So through the farming rules for water, it's recommended that farms have 6 months slurry storage so they are able to comply with those rules. However, there is no sort of legislative sort of enforcement on having 6 months slurry storage, and that's not sort of expected at the moment. Further down the line, it is just a recommendation. Then we've also got the clean air strategy, and this was announced in 2019, and this outlines various proposals all aimed at reducing ammonia emissions. So this was aimed across different industries, and one of the industries within this strategy is agriculture. And within this sort of strategy, there was a proposal for all slurry and digestate stores to be covered by 2027. Now, there's not yet been a consultation on this. However, we are expecting a consultation at some point. So at the moment, there's nothing in sort of legislation or regulations about becoming sort of having covered slurry stores. However, it is something that we're expecting further down the line. The other big part of this is that we don't yet know what will suffice as a cover. And so there's quite a lot of unknowns on this, which can make it sort of quite difficult to plan. But at the moment, there's no requirement for that cover. But like I say, it is something that we are still expecting in the next sort of few years. So, I mean, the next slide is just a brief one about sort of the first stages when you're trying to plan what slurry storage you need. And when you know what your legal requirement is, whether it's 4 months, 5 months, whether you think you need that 6 months to comply with the EA farming rules for water, I think the first thing you need to do is actually figure out how much slurry storage you have and how much you're going to need going forwards. And just put on the what is slurry, the definition, because although it might seem pretty basic and a lot of you should hopefully know, it's surprising how many farms still go on to that separating dirty water and slurry, when actually any fouled water is counted as slurry and should be treated as slurry. So you need to make sure that you are treating everything that is fouled in any way as slurry. So if you haven't already, the best thing really to do to calculate your storage requirements is to use AHDB Slurry Wizard. So it's quite simple to use. It shouldn't take too long to sort of fill in the information, your livestock numbers, your yard areas, drainage, herd size, milk yields. That's all sort of the information that's required. And that will then tell you how much slurry storage you have and if you're compliant or not at the moment. And you can really use this tool as then a base to see what you need to do. So you can plan different scenarios to see if reducing your rainwater going into the store, if covering yard areas might help, if you can expand your store, how much do you have to expand your store, or if it's going to be building a new store and how big that new store is going to have to be. So it's a great tool to have a play with if you haven't already. So then if you do need to increase your slurry storage, you need to look at the options and figure out how to finance it. And I think Mel will come on to this more in a little while. But one of the options available over the next couple of years is the Slurry Infrastructure Grant. So we saw the first round of these grants open late last year, with the initial online checker closing in January this year. And we're expecting 2 more sort of larger rounds to come. One later this year, I think in autumn it's expected to open, and then another round in 2024. But at the moment, there's nothing expected after 2024. So if it is something you're interested in, it's worth sort of starting to look now so you don't miss this opportunity. And there may be a few sort of changes from the last round when the next round's open in the autumn and then next year. But really largely we expect it to stay fairly similar. So I'm just going to run through the grants of what we know from the first round, and then hopefully you can start to plan to see if it's something that might be of use to you. So these grants are aimed at replacing, building new or expanding existing slurry stores to provide 6 months of storage. So you are able to increase the store to provide more than 6 months of storage, but you need to fund this yourself. And the other key bit here is that you'll need to maintain 6 months storage for the duration of the agreement. So if you're planning on increasing your livestock numbers significantly over the next 5 years, you need to ensure that you also increase your slurry storage, so you have 6 months storage over the next 5 years whilst your agreement is in place. And the other key part of the grant is that the stores funded through the grant need to be fitted with an impermeable cover. So as I said before, we don't yet know what the future legislation around covers will look like, but sort of DEFRA have said that having an impermeable cover that's funded through this grant will at least match sort of future regulations or go above and beyond anything that will come in the next few years. So it's still worth looking into these grants, even though we don't know what that future legislation may look like. And then, as I said, the first round checker closed in January, and I think about 370 of those who applied for that round were invited to the full application stage. And so more rounds are expected to open, and these are likely to be larger rounds. So if you didn't get through in the first round, there will be more opportunities. And in the first round, some of you may know that there were sort of quite specific target areas. We don't know what that'll look like for future rounds, but hopefully they may expand those areas, so it gives more opportunity to the wider areas. Then a bit of information about what's available through the grants. So the grants were for between £25,000 and £250, and these will be paid in arrears. So we're quite used to this in grants, but it can cause some cash flow pressures, so it's worth thinking about when you're initially applying. So one of the things that sort of changed through the grants is there've been sort of standard costs for the various items available. And originally, when the online checker first opened late last year, it was sort of said that you'd get 50% of these costs, regardless of what the actual cost was to you. Now, this has now been amended to say that the claims are a maximum of the 50% of the final cost. So if the project costs you less than the sort of standard costs, you will only receive 50% of what you have spent. And then the final point here is that there's no quotes or anything needed to be submitted for the slurry grants, which has been the case in some of the other larger grants. But you will need to sort of share those invoices, so you can only claim that 50% at a maximum. So I've put up a list of sort of the items which were available in the first round and the standard costs associated with these. These may change slightly in future rounds, and I expect they'll sort of stay largely similar. As with the grant amounts listed, I can't imagine they'll sort of change a huge amount. And it's worth just mentioning here that all the covers and the additional items, they are only available when you're also applying for a new or expanded or upgrading store. You can't just have a cover or the additional items as a standalone sort of grant. However, you can sort of get covers through Countryside Stewardship capital grants as a standalone item. So if that's something you're interested in, it's worth looking at those grants. And probably the thing we've got questioned on most within this is, are separators included? And separators aren't included through this large grant scheme because they are on this small grants, Slurry and Productivity, which closed earlier this month, but may be open again. So yeah, separators aren't on this larger scheme. So the application process is in 2 parts. So firstly, there's an online checker, which is fairly simple information needed. And I'd say you can quite easily sort of complete it within sort of 15 to 30 minutes. However, I think if you are sort of thinking about applying for future rounds, it's really important to start thinking about what you need to do early. You don't really want to rush it and then regret what you've sort of applied for at a later date. So I think if you are interested, start thinking about it and planning what you require early on. And then the stage 2 is sort of the full application. So this is when you'll have to provide quite a lot more depth on your location and design, and where you have to go through sort of the planning process before you can get that full application submitted. So I think questions are at the end, so I'll pass over, I think, back to Nicola and then to Hannah.
Can you see my screen? Perfect. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on tonight. It's nice to see so many people. I'm Hannah Moule from the Rural Planning Co, and my part tonight is going to be just talking about the planning permission side and making sure you get the correct permissions when you're thinking about expanding or building new slurry stores. Now, generally speaking, when I'm talking this evening, I'm largely sort of referring to slurry pits. Most of what I'm talking about obviously does apply to towers and above ground sort of bits of equipment as well, but I'll probably just keep using the phrase slurry pits just for ease. So I just wanted to run you through how we would go, we've got to get the right amount of permissions from a few different places, and it's sensible to do that in a certain order for it to sort of save you time and money. So I just wanted to run through what is sort of quite a good way of doing that. The first one, I'm trying to move that up. So the first thing is obviously once you have gone through and established the size and capacity required, as Emma showed you, then we can move on to designing it correctly. We've got to get approval from the Environment Agency, planning permission, and we must be mindful of any waste regulations that come into play as part of the construction. So the first thing to do in a organised format is to work out the preferred and best location and siting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's quite a lot to go through with that, but that's obviously the first thing to do. So size and capacity, check the location and the siting, and then following on from that, we want to start to design the system. Now that might be something that you already know how you want to design it and what it wants to look like, or it might be something that perhaps you need to get a consultant on board if it's more of a complex sort of multi-part system. So once you've got the design and you're reasonably clear on what you want it to look like and how you want it to work, we've got to get that drawn up. So in order to draw it for both the Environment Agency and also for planning, we need to be able to show them what the current system is and what the proposed system is. So in order to do that, most commonly, we get what's called a topographical survey, which is a survey and then drawings of what the site or the yard or the buildings currently look like. And then on top of that, we can obviously build in and draw on what we're proposing it looks like when you've made these changes. So the topo survey, then we do some cross-section drawings, drawings from different angles and things, obviously depending on the complexity of it. So following on from that, we then, depending on what type of either pit or whatever you're going for, if it is an earthbound pit, then we need to do some soil testing, or you need to do soil testing, because it's important to know what the clay content is. And this comes on to the construction requirements and specifications of permeability and so on. So soil testing is next. Once you've got those three things, so once we sort of check the siting and design, topographical, you've got the drawings done, we know what it's going to look like, we've established that the soil, either the soil that you're using from your own farm is suitable, or the imported soil is suitable. That's the point at which it's good to go off to the Environment Agency, engage with them and get their approval. In my experience, they're fairly good with the negotiations. You can put something to them. If they're not quite happy with it, they'll come back and make some suggestions and amendments. It's not quite as sort of it's refused, it's approved. They'll engage with you and then hopefully working it up to get an approval. Once you've got that, then is a good time. Here we go. Then is a good opportunity and time to go for the planning. I would not suggest going for the planning, particularly before you've engaged the EA, because of course, if there's something fairly fundamental that they don't approve of, you might have to actually go back and change the planning. So best to do it in this order. And obviously that's what I'm going to talk about more is the planning. We need to just check any waste exemptions. Now, if you're importing soil, you might well need to have the relevant waste exemptions and license. So I'm not going to cover that in any more detail, but I just wanted to raise it as something to be aware of. And then obviously, hopefully, once you've got EA approval, once you've got planning, you've applied for any waste exemptions you need to, hopefully you're in a position to work. So the location and siting, there's two elements to this. So the first thing is to make sure that it is compliant with the regulations. Most of these you'll be fairly familiar with because they sort of do a lot of what you are and aren't allowed to do anyway with muck. But in terms of any new build or extension, we have to make sure that it is at least 10 metres clear of rivers, ditches, streams, and any land drains as well, which can be a little bit trickier to locate. We've got to avoid areas at risk of flooding, can't be within 50 metres of a borehole or a spring. And then there's a couple of other things like groundwater protection zones. And also, if you are in or close to any of those designations that's up on the screen, like SSSIs, special areas of conservation, then it's actually better to engage with the EA at the start, because those are the sorts of things that can be more difficult down the line. So line your ducks up earlier with that. If you need to check any of those designations, you can use Magic Maps. So those are sort of the regulatory things, and then we move on to the planning things. Now, I would generally say, don't let the tail wag the dog on this one. Some people sort of ask us, oh, well, where are we going to be able to get planning for something? Generally speaking, if it meets regulation and if it is practical in terms of your design from your farming systems point of view, then that is also ordinarily the best place from a planning point of view. So start with regulations, start with what you need from a farming business, and that is normally the best place for it to go. If you have multiple sites or you could dig anywhere around it, then we look at sort of proximity to other areas of the farmyard, grouping of buildings, grouping of, you know, this sort of infrastructure. Obviously, the distance from neighbours in terms of odour mitigation and everything is quite a biggie, so that's quite high up on the list. But also things like landscape impact and other sort of planning considerations. But don't get too tied up in the planning to start off with. Start with what you need, and then normally we can make the planning fit. But you do have to sort of tie all these things in together, I suppose. So there's a very quick guide here. This is only very brief, but this is a quick guide in terms of the sort of meeting with SAFO and the British Standards regulations in terms of actually how you're, again, I am talking about pits, but it does apply to other types of stores as well. So I'll leave this on here. You can have a quick squiz through it, but it's generally speaking, everything's got to be impermeable: pits, tanks, pipes, channels. it's obviously got to, if you're building it something a little bit like this one, where you've got multiple, well, and any pits, but especially where you've sort of got multi-system here, is that everything's got to be capable of withstanding the load from it, and then also sort of in relation to each other as well. So occasionally with bigger systems like this one, you know, you might in some instances need to get an engineer involved to calculate some of that loading. If it's an earth bank store, it needs to have a reasonably substantial clay content, and those materials have to be confirmed by a lab analysis, and both the EA and planning will want to see that. The impermeable soil, so the clay that you're lining this with, must be present to a depth of at least 1 metre. You can use imported clay if necessary, but that's got to be tested, and in some instances, if it's not available, you can use obviously a sort of synthetic liner. But even for the synthetic liner, for example, for the EA, we've got to be able to show kind of manufacturer guarantees and things that it is, you know, it can last for 20 years, I think it is, and you know, that it's impermeable and so on. So again, just at the bottom there, it's good practice to agree all of this stuff with the EA before planning, and very definitely before construction. So the stuff that we've got to get ready for the EA are drawings, and I think sort of described that at the start. Really, it's what's there now, what it's going to look like, and this obviously applies to extensions, new pits, above ground tanks, and everything. In some instances, not always, you might need a little bit of help in calculating the you know, the depth of the bunds and the width of the banks and so on. And again, this, you know, getting the soil testing is essential. So all of these little things that we've got to get set up, ready to move forward, then you're in the position to notify the Environment Agency. And the things that I've talked about is largely what they're wanting to see from you. There's a specified list. Ordinarily, our clients do this sort of that application themselves, so we can help get all of the stuff ready, because obviously a lot of it is there for the EA and also for the planning. But more often than not, the actual notification to the Environment Agency is made by the clients themselves, but we can assist if necessary. Then we look at what the route, we've sort of done all of that, hopefully got approval or somewhere close from the Environment Agency. So now we're looking at making the application to your local authority. We've got everything ready, and we have to decide whether we're going to use permitted development rights or make a full planning application. Now, permitted development rights are basically, most of you'll be familiar with them. They fit in the Town and Country Planning Act as a general permitted development order, and it grants and infers certain rights to holdings to carry out certain types of development without expressly getting planning permission. So in some instances, you don't actually need to apply for full planning. You have the automatic right to undertake certain types of development without actually getting the consent. What you have got to do, though, is still a notification to the council, which is what's called a 28-day notice, and that's probably language that everybody's familiar with, a 28-day notice to the council. So what that notice is telling them that you're intending to exercise your permitted development rights, and that this is the work that you're intending to do. Now, the biggie on this is that you can't use permitted development rights for slurry if you're within 400 metres of what's called a protected dwelling, and a protected dwelling is basically a third party's house. So not yours, not the farmhouse, not staff members on the farm or the farm cottages, not what's associated with the farm, but anybody else's house. If you're within 400 metres of someone's house, you don't have permitted development rights for slurry. So in that situation, we move forwards and it's a planning application. In reality, this information that we submit to both of those things, whether it's permitted development or a planning application, isn't dissimilar. The permitted development route is just a bit simpler. I'd describe it as a leaner application. It's a bit quicker, less of your neighbours find out about it, which can be a good thing. Yeah, it can just be a little bit of a quicker route, but the majority of slurry applications go into a full planning application. So permitted development is the sort of thing that if you are over 400 metres away and you're doing a small extension or something like that, it might be useful to use your permitted development rights. If it's likely to be a whole new system, it's unlikely to come into that. So But again, you know, when you chat to us about what your proposal is, we can talk you through and help guide you as to which of those routes is the best one to go down. So the planning application itself, it's largely all the things that we've talked about and the things that you've already done and prepared ready for the EA approval. So we've got the topos, the drawings, the calculations, construction details, soil permeability. And then us as planning consultants, we take all of that, we combine and coordinate all of that, and we put that together with the planning document. So the application forms, planning statement incorporating justification, the information about your farming business, why you should be allowed it, why it's important for your farm, etc. There's a slim possibility, depending on where you are and proximity to neighbours, etc., that you might have to also produce an odour survey at that point. But again, that's the sort of thing that we can work out as we go along. So that's your planning application and how we put it together. Just to give you, it's very difficult to put costs on planning, but I know people like to have a ballpark. So it very much depends on whether it's a small extension of the Slurry store or a whole new system. But if you were to go sort of somewhere straight down the line for a medium-sized dairy farm and they're looking to put in a new pit or an above ground something, this is probably around the sort of ballpark that you're talking about, which is perhaps 5,000 to 6,000, just as a rough guide. It could be less, it could be more, and that's presuming that you're sort of designing your own scheme, you know, that you're not employing consultants to come in and work that out for you. So that, I think, is probably it. So we're the Rural Planning Co. We do planning for all of these things. We're specialists in all types of rural planning, as the name might suggest. And we would love to invite you to give us a call, free initial chat, and obviously to see if we can help you with anything. We're very happy. So I think that's it for me, Nicola.
Thank you, Hannah. So just while you've been talking, there's a couple of things come up on the questions. So as we are doing okay for time, I thought we'd just go through them. So Steve Smith, more of a comment which you may be interested in. He says, ammonia emissions are based on surface area covered or not. So smaller and deeper favours you when it comes to ammonia assessment. Which is
smaller and deeper is better.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, excellent, yeah. And obviously takes up less room as well.
Yeah, and then a question from Alice. If we already have planning permission for an earth-banked slurry store, can we apply for the grant? You and Emma, I suppose.
Probably more of an Emma question, I think, probably, is it?
Oh, Emma, are you on mute?
Yeah, I think it depends how far along you are with the planning. If it's being fully applied for and you've made a start, you can't apply for the grant. But if it's just in the early stages of planning, then I think you can. So it depends on the stage that that's at. It's worth looking into. But if you've made any start on works at all, then you won't be able to get the grant on that.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so if we pass over now to Mel, so Mel's that huge topic of financing the project. So let's see how we find the money.
Perfect, thank you, Nicola, and thank you everyone else, and thanks for joining us. Can I just confirm that you can see my screen or the presentation? Does that come up?
Yes, yeah, we can, Mel, yeah.
Perfect. So as Nicola introduced me, I'm Mel Shipley. I am one of the senior agriculture managers here at Oxbury Bank. And I basically, you'll find me anywhere between Cheshire and sort of southwest Scotland. That's part of the world that I dabble in, and specifically do a lot of the dairy farmers lending. There's a team of about 35 of us now at Oxbury, and we all come from agriculture and have worked in the sort of professional industry for a number of years. So when we say we know what we're talking about, we tend to sort of have a good steer on what's happening in the industry. But what I'm going to talk about today, and I will fly through this relatively quickly, but please feel free to contact me afterwards or ask any questions. But effectively what I wanted to do was go through what Oxbury can offer, and you know, if you're looking at doing something to improve your slurry storage, but also just anything that we're looking at. So we've got a wide range of products, including sort of revolving credit facility, farm loans. We do a little bit of food chain finance as well, and also asset finance. it is very much simple stuff. There's nothing sort of hidden in there that you would think. There's no additional conditions or covenants, things that are going to probably add just a lot of extra work and stuff to your lives. We want to keep things simple. We're a bank that's been built for farmers by farmers. So with that in mind, all of our policies and our products have been designed to suit your business, and every facility letter that we send out is totally unique. With that, and this is sort of the route to market, and the bit that you'll probably want to know is how you get in touch with us. So in terms of the asset finance, that's largely broker led at the minute, but in terms of the farm loans and the flexi credit facilities that we offer, that can be either directly to us, or you can apply through the Oxbury website. If you're going to apply through the Oxbury website, we automatically get that sort of into our system, and someone will contact you within 24 hours. And what I would say is that when you're looking at doing a project, whether it is updating your slurry storage or doing anything on farm, wanting to buy a bit of land, whatever, I would always recommend that you get in touch with the bank as soon as possible, because it can take a little bit to get things sorted. We tend to be able to operate a lot quicker than what the traditional banks can do, because we're completely cloud-based. So everything is done online, and it is super quick. The bit that I'm going to talk about more so now is just the farm loans and the flexi credit facilities, which are our working capital facilities, which I think are going to be probably most suited for when you're looking at doing a project like this. With our term loans, we will do anything from in terms of length, we'll go 6 months out to 25 years. We can do interest only for certain periods of it as well, or we can do long dated interest only if it's the right thing to do for that business. We also have a different way of taking security as well. So whilst it's always good to get as much security as possible, we're a little bit more relaxed in terms of what we will take. And one thing that we can do is put a charge over livestock and dead stock. So especially for tenant farmers or people that are just starting out in the industry, there's usually not that much capital behind you, but this just means that we can sort of tap into it in a different way. If we're going to be doing that and going down the livestock dead stock route, that is what we call an agricultural charge in England and Wales. Unfortunately, in Scotland, we can't do that. However, the alternative is that we can also do fixed and floating bonds or debentures for limited companies as well. We'll write that down to 40% of the value, but that is just a sensitivity that we have to do as part of the regulatory requirements. With lands, we will go to 75% loan to value, which is a bit more than what the high street banks will do. And in terms of that, if we're going to take a charge over your land, it can either be a first, second, or in some instances third. We're more than happy to work with your existing bank if it means that we can support you in sort of improving your business and making it as efficient as possible. We also, what we can do, which is very different, and we're even in the market that I come from, which is a very seasonal New Zealand, spring block carving system, or is what they all do out there. We can also structure the repayments to suit your cash flow. So that effectively means that we can set it up so you don't pay capital off when the cows are dry, for example, if you are spring or autumn block, and then we just ratchet up the capital payments when you are generating income to cover the loan payments off. You'd still pay it down in the same amount, but what that does, it's about utilisation of cash more appropriately. And for us, we don't need you to repay the loan back when when you're not actually generating that much and you're just covering your overheads and feed costs and things like that. So that is very cool. If it was able to go out into New Zealand and Australia, it would be an absolute hit over there. When it comes to the slurry storage and that sort of thing, we have been looking at a lot of different projects, and I'll talk about the grant funding first, but obviously with this first round that's come out, not all areas have been able to access the grant funding. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't support you in doing that. So we can still go through our usual option, but obviously because you've got to pay for everything up front, not everybody has that sort of cash available in the business, or it's going to severely, you might have to cut something back so you can be able to afford it. What we can do is we can fund it on what we call our Oxbury Flexi Credit initially. It's on an interest-only basis until the project is done, and then once the grant funding comes in, that part of the facility is repaid, and then we term out the remaining as to whatever that could be, and that could be anything from sort of 6 months through to sort of 25 years, depending on what it is that you want, and we'll sit down with you and go through it to work out exactly what is going to suit your business and your family as well. So that's the key thing, is we want to make it, we don't want to make you pay back something really quickly when that's just actually going to eat away at the cash position within the business. When they say cash is king, I definitely stand by that, and it is something that is or can be sometimes hard to find. What we will do as well is, so when it comes to sort of applying for a loan, say you've come through the Oxbury website, what we'll do is we will look, we'll give you a call and we'll just have a chat, and depending on sort of where you are and who's around, we'll get out on farm and meet you. If we can do it really quickly and you're not bothered about seeing somebody on farm, we can do it all over the phone or via a Teams call, and then sort of come out later once everything's done. We'll go up to £100,000 unsecured, provided that this affordability is key. And I think that is the thing that I want to stress. We don't do security-backed lending anymore. So just because you've got an asset doesn't mean that we'll lend you money, because from the regulator's perspective, that is what we call it's just not safe lending, and it's not treating customers fairly. What we do is a lot of stress testing and look at the actual affordability of the business. So we look at a variety of different factors, including interest rates, including milk price, feed costs, and just try and take a bigger, wider view at what's best, and structure it so that your business can afford it. No problem. It's not going to put additional pressure on the system or anything like that. Security is always good to have, but again, as I said earlier, we can sort of go get around that in some instances with various different things. But I guess the key thing, provided that the affordability and the security piece is covered off, is the people. For us, we're lending to people, and without the people and the businesses, it doesn't matter what you do, the loan's not going to get repaid. So that's why we really want to sit down and work out what you want. And I always ask when I go out on farm, sort of, what is it that keeps you up at night, or what is it that's going to help you sleep at night as well. And that's how we sort of go around it. The last little piece, and this is slightly different, and it is a slight product push as well in a certain sense, but I think I've done all right having got through 4 slides without doing too much. But the Oxbury New Gen Fund. So a lot of people struggle to access funding when they're first going into business, and these are for people who are new into the industry and want to get set up. So it could be that you're going into a share farming agreement, or you're going into a joint venture or something like that, and part of that is that you need to sort of stump up some cash. So what Oxbury will do is we'll fund up to 100% of the lending required, based off an approved cash flow plan. But not only that, we'll also cover the cost of advice, business and financial advice, as well as just general support as well, from before we get the facility in place and activated right through to the first 3 years. And as you'll see on the screen, we've got a number of different consultancies and individuals involved that do those plans with us. Kite's involved as well, and you know what, it's been really successful. It's awesome to be able to support people into their first venture. And that, the advice side of things, that could be, once or twice a year, but we will cover up to sort of quarterly meetings for the first 3 years at no expense whatsoever. So just the last few things, I suppose, and when you are approaching the bank, we are going to ask you for information. A lot of people, you don't really want to share that. Everything is safe with us, and typically what we'll need is last 3 years annual accounts, last 3 months bank statements, and if we can get dairy costings and milk statements and things like that, it just helps build out a bit more of a robust picture, and it means that myself and my colleagues can then do the proper stress tests and sensitivity analysis. So we make sure that we're lending you money that you can afford and isn't going to sort of break the bank, because nobody likes having to do that and having to sort of have those tough conversations. So we're just trying to sort of be a little bit more holistic in our view. But that is really all I had. So I just wanted to, I'll have any questions if there is any.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mel. That's really interesting. There is a question I think probably for Emma. What are the practical options for covering slurry stores on farms that don't separate or don't want to separate their slurry? That's from Paul.
very much depends on your situation and where you are. Floating covers can work on quite a lot of different lagoons. They're not necessarily the best on sort of big open lagoons that you have to stir. There isn't sort of a really great option, but I think it depends on your scenario. Get an expert in if you're unsure and find the right option for you. As I said before, until we know what the legal requirements of that will be, it's quite difficult and could potentially be quite expensive on certain lagoons. On sort of tanks and things, it's a lot easier to cover those, and there's a lot more options really than on sort of bigger, larger lagoon areas.
Okay, thank you. A question here I've sort of picked up as we've gone through. I'd sort of always thought what comes first really, finance or planning? And then I was, from listening to Hannah, she sort of talked about getting the EA agreement. If you were a client, would you say you need the EA agreement first and then finance and then full planning, or how would that work? So I suppose that's for maybe Hannah first and then Mel should comment on that.
I think it certainly engage with the EA. The most of the information that you need for the EA is also crossed over into the planning, so you're almost doing the two things together anyway. But in terms of actually submitting it, I think it's best to go off and engage with the Environment Agency fairly early doors, because obviously if you need to make any significant changes, then better to understand that earlier rather than later. So from my view, in terms of EA and planning, I think EA first, then planning. I think where you slot finance into that quite often, and again, for Mel to answer really, but you kind of need to know whether you can get planning and whether you can get finance at roughly the same sort of time. So it's a viability thing on both of those things. I think probably you just make the phone calls, you know, reasonably early in your planning, and start to get those things lined up as you go along. I don't know if Mel thinks any differently.
No, I would agree completely, Hannah. And I guess the thing with us is it's always good to get the bank out as soon as possible to make sure that you can afford it, what you're planning on doing when you start to get those quotes, because you don't sort of want to start incurring cost and get down the line and find that actually you've got nothing sort of backing you up, if that makes sense. From our side of things, where planning is required, we do need to see confirmation of that before we release any funds. So whether that is sort of a confirmation from the consultant that you're using or something like that, but we will need to see that before we sort of pay anything out, if it is required and that sort of thing.
Okay, right, let's just have a look here. We've got a question. If we already have 4 months storage, could you get grant on an extra 2 months with cover on that particular store, i.e. the original store doesn't have a cover? Emma?
Yeah, so you can expand an existing store to provide that 6 months storage and then get the cover. If you were building a new store, it would just be on that new store and the cover on that. But yeah, you can go from 4 months to 6 months and then get the cover on that. But yeah, or if you just wanted a cover as a standalone on your 4 months storage without sort of the expansion, then you could do that through stewardship, capital grants, and have a look into that if that's an alternative way for you.
Okay, and another one, similar thread. We have a grant in place for a slurry cover, but are yet to come across a decent product. Could you point us to a decent product, earthbound lagoons, not tin tanks?
Not sure off the top of my head. It depends sort of where you are really. So yeah, it might be, if you want to come back to us, I can perhaps point you in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and just from our perspective, one of the questions we get asked a lot at the Rural Planning Company is how long does it take to get planning permission? we know that a lot of the councils have quite a lot of issues within their planning departments. Hannah, have you got any thoughts on that?
Give it as much time as you possibly can, really, for, you know, because of all of these things that we've been talking about tonight tie in, don't they? So what we're talking about with the EA, the planning, getting a grant, Mel, getting finance, you know, all of them tie in, and of course all of those things do actually take time. You know, I would even go so far as to sort of, you know, allow 12 months from, you know, when you actually want to start building it, work back 12 months before that and start the ball rolling then, you know, and give yourself plenty of time so you're not under too much pressure. I realise that might not always be the case if you're sort of working to timescales on grants and things. From purely a planning point of view, you know, if we were talking about from the point at which we were ready to go in with planning, so we've got EA approval, ready to go in with planning, because we've already got most, we normally sort of say we need about six to 8 weeks to do our end of the planning application, but of course we've actually already done quite a lot of that, so that could be shortened. So once we've actually got an application submitted to the local authority, as you alluded to, Nicola, there is a really big variance in local authority as to how quickly they're processing, even getting through validation. So validation is the process of them sort of registering the application and making it live. In some instances, we're having delays of several months in certain local authorities, which are taking a really long time just to even get it validated, let alone determine the application. So the longer lead in you can give it, the better. But you know, if ordinarily it might be between 2 and 4 weeks to get something validated, and then from that point, once it's validated, if it's what's called a minor application, which most of them will be, in theory it should be an 8-week application process. In some instances, you know, if it's particularly convoluted, or if neighbours start, you know, kicking off, then it can really extend. So yes, I think, you know, it's going to be no shorter than 4 months, even just for the planning. And, you know, but the longer you can allow and give yourself lead time, the better.
Thank you. Emma, do underground slatted tanks qualify as being covered?
In terms of the grants, no, and they're not sort of covered within the grant funding. In terms of the legal requirements going forward, we don't know yet if they would. I'd imagine they should be. But yeah, like I said, we don't know on that side yet. But yeah, through the grant funding, you can't sort of have underground storage facilities through them. So.
Okay, looking at slurry lagoons, earth banked and stirring with cover, what options are there for stirring? Are aeration systems any good in these scenarios?
Again, it's very system specific, and yeah, there are various different systems, depends on a lot of different factors. So yeah, it's probably one to pick up after, if that's okay. Okay,
brilliant. Okay, that's the end of our questions. So have you any other comments, or are we happy to finish here?
I think is it fair to say, Nicola, and hopefully Mel and Emma, that if anybody listening or following on, you know, listening to the recording would like to contact Emma, Mel and myself, please feel free to, hopefully, you know, if they want to pick up on any of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially probably some of the more detailed ones. I'm sure Emma would be happy to go through some of those separately. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'd just like to say thank you very much to our panelists for your knowledge. That was really interesting, and yeah, as Hannah has said, if you'd like to contact us after the webinar, I'm sure all of us would be delighted to speak to you. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.